In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make a reversible quilt as you go quilt. Basically, quilt as you go is making one block at a time, and this is one block, and quilting it. And then when you've got enough blocks to the size of the quilt that you want to make it, you can then join them all together. This is a really quick method, and in fact I've used a zigzag stitch, you'll see this shortly, to join all of the pieces. If you wanted to make the join invisible, then you can hand stitch these together. I've chosen to use echo quilting, which is basically sewing inside the seam. I've just sewn inside each one of these triangles, which is a quick way of doing this. If you've got more time on your hands, or if you like hand sewing, then why not take each individual block and hand stitch, not necessarily in triangles like this, but maybe floral designs or big stitch designs, or just hand stitch around the triangles. That's entirely up to you. What I want to show you is the technique of actually making these squares. My finished blocks, and that's explain later, and of course all of the measurements, imperial and metric, are in the description box below the video. But each one of my blocks is just over 6 inches square. But experiment, try using different sizes of squares and see what kind of design that you can come up with. You could make these a lot smaller, you could make them a lot larger as well. Now my little quilt here is actually made for Maddie the ragdoll, so it's for her bed quilt, so this is plenty big enough, but it's the same technique if you just want to carry on and make something that's a full-size bed quilt. That's entirely up to you. So the measurements I'm going to give you are for one block. That's one 6-inch block. In here I've got 9, so you times those measurements by 9. If you want to make something a lot larger, I'm going to leave that to you to work out your fabric measurements for that, but that's very, very simple to do. So I hope you like it, I hope you enjoy making it. Here's how we do it. For a finished block of this size, I'm going to need 4 pieces of fabric, which each measure 5 inches square. All of your measurements are going to be in both metric and imperial in the description box underneath the video. So 4 pieces of fabric exactly the same, and I've used the Brier rose fabric for 3 of those, and a pin spot poplin for the 4th one, because I think it gives a really nice contrast. Having 2 of the darker and 2 of the lighter, I think really make the design stand out. And I've also cut my square of wadding. I will show you how to double check the size of that as we make these up. So let's sew these pieces together first of all, and it may be an idea when you're piecing these together to do all of the blocks for the size of the quilt that you want at the same time, so that you know that you're sewing them in the same order, because if we do that, it's going to have a very different look as you piece them together. So we just want to make sure that all of the pieces are in the same order. So let's sew these 2 pieces right sides together first of all, and it doesn't really matter whether you're using a directional or a non-directional print. This one's directional, this one's non-directional, because they all kind of get twisted up as you're sewing anyhow. And these 2 right sides together. Now I'm using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. That doesn't have to be exact as long as it's consistent. And let's just sew down the right hand side. So if you're using the edge of your foot as your seam allowance of your presser foot, then that's absolutely fine as long as you do that in all of the pieces. So we'll sew along those edges, and we'll just chain stitch onto the next piece here. We'll take this out, snip those apart, and then I'm going to press them. So I happen to be pressing to the darker side. It doesn't really matter, but on the one side I want to press the seam in one direction, and on the other side in the opposite direction. So this one is going to be pressed towards the spot, and this one is going to be pressed towards the darker blue fabric. Whoops, and then we'll take these 2 sections, so that's what we have at the moment, and we're going to put these right sides together. And the reason I press these in opposite directions is now that when I put these 2 pieces of fabric together, because the seams are pressed in opposite ways, they nest. It makes a nice little joint in the center here, which means that you're going to get a perfect point. You can stick a pin in there if you like. It's not really necessary, but if you really wanted to make sure you've been very accurate, then just pop a pin in that seam, and then we're going to sew all the way down here again with that same seam allowance. So as I come up to the join, I can just make sure that those are nestling together, and that's important because this is going to be right in the center of your block, so it's going to be noticeable if your seams don't match perfectly. But that's a very easy way of doing it. And then back to the ironing board again, and I'm going to press that center seam open. Don't beat yourself up if you can't be bothered. If you want to press to one side, it won't make too much of a difference, but ideally, if you can just press this open, you'll have a nice neat join in the center. Perfect point. And then we'll take this piece, we're going to fold it back over again. Again, we've got the center pieces nestling together because the seams are in the opposite direction, and we're going to sew down both of the short sides, but we'll need to leave a turning gap in one side of just about a couple of inches. So I'm going to do that here, so I'm going to reverse back again, leave my gap and carry on sewing, and then again sew down the opposite side on the short side. So I have this. Then we're going to take the 2 points of the center and open those out so that these two seams meet in the middle here. And I am going to put a pin in there just to make sure that they match, because this is a reversible quilt, so it's important that your points match on both sides. And then we're going to sew across here and across here. And of course, take your pin out as you sew. So when we tease this a little bit, you can see how it forms into a square. So on the one side, I have my turning gap here. So I'm going to turn this over to the side without the gap. Now I can double check the size of the wadding that I need to cut. So flatten this out from side to side. It's just over 6 inches on mine, and that should be a perfect square. So cut your wadding to that size. You need the size of the square that you've just made, right up to the edges. So when you cut out your wadding, I'm going to move my machine out of the way, it needs to be glued onto this part of the, block. So I'm going to use a spray adhesive. I'm going to use my 505 spray, which is temporary basting spray. If you don't want to use a spray adhesive, you could use a glue pen, but only glue along the seams because we don't want to stain the fabric, and that can sometimes happen. Or, depending on what the purpose of your quilt is for, you could use a fusible fleece, which won't be quite as soft as the 80-20 wadding that I've used here, but that will stick then to this side of the fabric. So let's pop this down over the top in the center. If you're using a 505 spray, as I just have, or any kind of basting spray, the glue will automatically kind of disappear after a while. It's not a permanent spray, so you can peel this off and move it if you don't get it perfectly square, but you don't have to worry about washing it out or anything like that. After a few days or weeks, that glue will automatically disappear. by which time, of course, you'll have quilted this, so all of the wadding will be kept in place anyhow. So I'd leave that for maybe 30 seconds or so, just to make sure you've got a good adhesion. And then we're going to turn this the right side out. So where was my turning up? There we go. So let's push this through. This is why it's important to glue the wadding in place, because as you pull this through, it can move, and it still can if you're using a basting spray like my 505, but I can maneuver that back into place again. I'll show you in just a second. So let's push this out. I'm going to use my turning tool to do that and push into the corners, because I don't want to use something too sharp and go all the way through the fabric, and these tools are ideal. The right tools for the job makes your job a lot easier. So let's push into the corner pieces. And then I can feel this and just make sure that the wadding goes right up to the edge and it hasn't rolled over at all. To make the points really pointy, and this is quite important because these are going to be joined together, as you can see here in the corners, so it's nice to get these as pointy as we can. You can use a needle or a pin, but I'm just going to use a very sharp pair of tweezers just to tease out the very corners to make those as square as I can. But I don't want to damage the fabric, so again I'm using the right tools for the job. And there's the last one. Then back with the iron again. Remember, I do have my turning gap, so I'm going to line that up so it sits nice and neat and iron this flat on both sides. And then with the turning gap, I'm going to sew that closed by hand. So I'm going to take my needle and thread and make a slip stitch. So I'm going into the seam as it's sewn, so my knot in the thread disappears, and took that right out of the way so it's inside the block. And then, whoops, I'm going to take the needle into one side, a little bit like a ladder stitch, into one side of the fabric and then out through the fold, and then go directly underneath that fold, go in and out. And I'm not going all the way through this so I see it on the other side of the fabric. I'm just catching the fabric with a short stitch and a little bit of the wadding, but that's fine. So again, from the folded side into the opposite side and a very small stitch. The smaller the stitch you make, whoops, my needle's just come undone, the more invisible the seam's going to be. So nice small stitches, because remember this quilt is reversible. You can see it on both sides, so it's important that both sides are kept really neat. There we go. So the smaller the turning gap you make, the less hand sewing you'll have to do to sew that closed. And then when this is finished, we'll quilt the block. That's it, doesn't take very long, can't really see the stitches. I'm using a very pale grey thread, which I find with pattern fabric is the most invisible one to use. Pale grey or beige are ideal, because if I chose a blue to match this one, it's not going to match any of the others. It could make your stitches really stand out if you use a colour. So a neutral colour works really well. Now I'm going to quilt this. Now do be aware, the way that this has been put together, the edges are on the bias, they'll stretch. So we want to keep this as flat as we possibly can. I've echo quilted around these, so I've sewn just inside the triangle shape, but this is where it's entirely up to you. If you wanted to sit and do a little bit of hand sewing, then why not do that? Sit in an evening and just stitch random patterns or a design that you have, or you could make even a flower shape in the centre. That's entirely up to you, however you feel like doing this. For speed's sake, just to show you, I've quilted inside the triangles. and you could carry on and just keep echo quilting inside. Personally, I wouldn't do a stitch in the ditch to quilt these, because you can't guarantee that the stitching on both sides will be exactly the same. Hopefully it should, but you never know. It may be slightly off, and that would look a little bit odd. So I'm just going to stitch about 1/4 of an inch inside, just once. It does need quilting in some respect to hold the wadding in place. But I love these projects because, you know, if you do want to do some hand quilting, you're quilting one block at a time. You don't have a huge quilt, which can be quite daunting. You're basically quilting a 6-inch square. And with a quilt as you go like this, you can keep adding to it as well. So if you decide after your quilt's finished, actually I'd like it a little bit bigger, then just add a few more squares. It's really simple. So again, I'm just going around about 1/4 of an inch inside the seam on each one of the triangles. And trim off any of these little loose threads on both sides, because remember, this is a reversible quilt. Now, as you can see, I've already started putting my pieces together, so I need to join an extra 3 pieces together here, and I've already made up my other blocks. So just making sure that they're all facing in the right direction, so all of the prints are facing as they should do. I'm going to join these 3 strips together, and the way I'm doing this is by using a zigzag stitch. So I'm going to put these 2 pieces together here. You won't be able to pin because you're not kind of making a seam like this, you're edging the edges together, and I'm going to do a very small zigzag stitch over the edge. Now it would be an idea to have a look on your or to have a play with the zigzag stitch on your sewing machine, and decide how wide and how long you want the stitches, because I think that the smaller you can make them, the less visible they're going to be. But if they're too small, they're not going to catch both sides of the fabric as you sew. So if you've got a scrap piece of fabric, it would be an idea to just have a play with that and make sure that you're happy with it. I've already tested mine out. As you can see, I've made some of this up already. So I'm going to take these 2 pieces, put the ends of them together, push that underneath the edge of my sewing machine foot, and I've just got my regular zigzag foot on the sewing machine, and then zigzag. I'm going to actually make that a little bit wider. So take your time with this. You don't want to overlap the fabrics, you want them to meet together. To be honest, it doesn't really matter if they do overlap by a minuscule amount, but if you can just make them meet edge to edge, would be ideal. Now you can hand sew this, you don't have to zigzag. I'm just thinking of the quicker alternative for you. If you've got the patience and you want to sit and hand sew, then that's absolutely fine, in which case I would put the 2 pieces together like so. I'd fold them over and then do a very tiny over edge stitch all the way down on the wrong side. I know it's reversible, but you're going to favour one side, I'm sure. So a tiny over edge stitch all the way down to hold those in place. But for this one, I'm doing it quickly. I'm going to use that zigzag stitch again. So line at the ends, the centre of my zigzag foot. I've got a central mark on my zigzag foot, so I know this is going to go right down the middle, and then just feed this into the centre of the foot. Now because this, as I said earlier on, is on the bias, it does have a little bit of stretch, which is a negative. It's kind of a positive in this respect, because you can ease the pieces if they don't match exactly to make them match. So you can still pull this a little bit to make the edges of fabric meet. Now when you've sewn all of the pieces together that you need in rows kind of going across like this, I've already sewn these two together, these are now going to go on the bottom. So again, starting at the end, trying to make sure that these points match up as well. To be honest, if it's not perfect, does it really matter? If those points in the centre don't match exactly, is it really that important? Nice if they do, bonus, but don't worry too much about it. I think, to be honest, the edge of the fabrics matching up perfectly is more important. So, because this is going to be the edge of your quilt. So make sure that those two edges match up as that goes underneath the foot of your sewing machine, and then sew them together. And again, any loose threads, then just snip those away. So let's give this one final press. You can use plenty of steam at this point if you want to, just make sure everything's nice and flat. And for me, that's the size of the quilt that I wanted, so that's finished. And again, just the same on both sides. Now you may feel that the edge of this isn't perfect and you want it to be perfectly bound. So if you wanted to add some bias binding all the way around the edge, that's achievable. You can do that, no problem. And that could really finish off the quilt and make it look really pretty. So I'll leave that down to you. The technique I wanted to show you was just how to do this quilt as you go and how to get this kind of effect. But as I said before, the beauty of a quilt like this, that's my finished size. And at this point I might think, I want to make it twice the size, I want to make it longer, I want to make it a table runner, I want to make a bed quilt. You can just carry on, as long as of course you've got the fabric, adding to this until you get the size that you like. So I hope you enjoy making yours. It's a very quick make. I think it looks really effective and I'm sure you're going to enjoy making yours. So thank you for joining me today. I shall see you again very soon. Bye bye.